The first thing Daniel noticed when he woke up was the smell. Not the sterile antiseptic scent of a hospital, but something richer, thicker, something like meat left out in the sun too long. He blinked against the too bright fluorescent lights, trying to remember why he was here. The memory came sluggishly, swimming up through layers of groggy confusion. A car accident, a blur of headlights, the screech of tires, the impact. Then nothing. He shifted and pain flared in his limbs, a dull, insistent ache beneath his skin. He looked down. His hospital gown was stiff with something dry and brownish. Blood. His blood. The realization made his stomach churn. A sound made him turn his head. A nurse stood by the bed, her back to him. She was fiddling with something on a metal tray, the instruments clinking softly. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me." The nurse turned too quickly, her movement jerky, as if startled. Her face was wrong. Not deformed, not scarred, just wrong. Her features didn't quite align. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth too wide. When she smiled, the skin at her cheeks bunched in ways that didn't make sense. "You're awake," she said, voice flat and distant. "That's good. We were worried." "Where am I?" he asked. The nurse cocked her head, considering. "The hospital." Something in the way she said it made his skin prickle. The hospital. His mind felt sluggish, tangled in gauze. He forced himself to focus. "My family. Was anyone else hurt? I was in a car accident." The nurse nodded as if she understood, but her face remained unsettlingly blank. "It's being handled. You just need to rest." She stepped closer, and he could smell her now. That same thick, cloying scent that filled the room. It came off her in waves, a terrible, organic stench, like something rotting from the inside. His stomach lurched. "I think I need a doctor." "Of course," she said. "I'll get one." She left without another word, moving with an odd, liquid grace. Daniel exhaled and looked down at himself again. His arms were bruised, his legs sore, but nothing felt broken. He tried to sit up and froze. His skin felt wrong, too tight, too dry, as if it didn't belong to him. His fingers trembled as he touched his forearm. The texture was off, not soft, not firm, just different. A noise made him turn his head. The doctor had arrived. The man was tall, his face lean and sharp, his lab coat immaculate. But there was something off about him, too. His eyes were the wrong shade. Not brown, not blue, not green. A color that had no name, shifting slightly when Daniel tried to focus on it. "Good to see you're awake," the doctor said, his voice oddly warm. "How are you feeling?" Daniel hesitated. He wanted to tell him something was wrong, that his body didn't feel like his own. But the words lodged in his throat. "Tired," he managed instead. The doctor smiled, teeth too white, too even. "That's normal. You went through quite a lot. Your recovery is going well." "Recovery from what?" Daniel asked. "What did you do to me?" The doctor's smile didn't waver. "Just what was necessary." Daniel's pulse quickened. "I want to see my chart." "Oh, I'm afraid we don't do that here." A cold pit opened in his stomach. "Where is here?" The doctor only smiled wider. Daniel pushed himself upright, ignoring the way his skin pulled unnaturally. His arms ached, but not like normal pain. It was something deeper, something wrong. The doctor watched him with polite interest. "You shouldn't push yourself." Daniel ignored him, throwing the blanket off his legs. His breath caught. His legs were his, but they weren't. The skin was the wrong color, slightly mismatched. His feet twitched when he willed them to move, but the sensation was delayed, as if the nerves had to think about responding. "What did you do to me?" he whispered. The doctor sighed, almost disappointed. "It's best not to dwell on it. The body adapts. It's remarkable that way." Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed. His feet touched the cold tile, and his knees nearly buckled. His balance was wrong. The nurse was back, standing in the doorway. He hadn't heard her come in. Her too wide mouth curled into a strange approximation of a smile. "You should rest," she said. Daniel lurched forward, ignoring the wave of nausea that rolled through him. His fingers brushed the IV stand, and he saw his hands properly for the first time. They weren't his. They moved when he commanded them, but the skin was different, slightly paler, with veins that didn't quite match the pattern he remembered. The nails were too neat, too clean. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. "What? What the hell is this?" The doctor tilted his head. "You were in an accident. We put you back together." "This isn't me," Daniel choked out. "It is now." The nurse and doctor exchanged a glance, and something unspoken passed between them. The nurse took a step forward. Daniel bolted. His feet slapped against the cold tile, his legs threatening to give out. He half stumbled into the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering above. The hallway stretched impossibly long, doors lining the walls. Some were open. He caught glimpses of movement inside, shapes that weren't quite human. A man sat in one room, staring at his hands, sobbing. His arms ended in hands that didn't match, one too large, one too small. A woman in another room peeled at the skin of her face, her features sloughing away like wax. Something loomed at the far end of the hallway. Not a person, not anything that should exist. It turned its head toward him, and though it had no eyes, he knew it saw him. Behind him, the doctor's voice rang out. "You'll get used to it." Daniel ran. The hospital corridors twisted, turned, stretched impossibly far. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to pulse, breathing. His own body betrayed him, every movement foreign, every limb sluggish. His breath came ragged, burning in lungs that felt too large or too small. Somewhere behind him, the doctor and nurse watched, smiling, waiting. The hallway went on forever, and Daniel knew, deep in the pit of his stolen stomach, that he would never leave. Ryan's fingers trembled as he peeled back the hospital gown. He already knew something was wrong. The doctors had been acting strange. The nurses barely looked at him, and every time he asked about his condition, they gave him polite, evasive smiles. But now, in the cold, sterile glow of his hospital room, he finally saw it. The stitches. A thick black seam ran down his abdomen, crude and uneven, like something stitched together in a rush. The moment he saw them, his stomach churned violently, not just from nausea, but from something else, something moving inside him. The skin around the stitches was swollen and puckered, angry red flesh that pulsed like a heartbeat. Ryan pressed a shaking hand to his stomach. The stitches twitched. He gasped and yanked his hand away, but the movement didn't stop. The sutures tightened slightly, the way a wound might cinch itself shut, except no one was touching them. He stared in horror as the individual threads crawled under his skin, slow, deliberate movements just beneath the surface, like worms burrowing. Then came the pain. A sharp, tearing sensation lanced through his gut, so sudden and violent that he fell back against the bed, screaming. It felt as if something inside him was pulling itself apart. The door burst open and a nurse rushed in. "Oh no," she whispered, her face turning ghostly pale. Ryan tried to speak, but his voice came out a wet gurgle as fresh pain ripped through his torso. His vision swam with hot, searing agony as something inside his stomach began to shift. The nurse hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning and slamming the emergency button. "Get Dr. Vasquez. He's waking up." Waking up? Ryan barely had time to process the words before the burning sensation grew unbearable. He felt something moving under his ribs, like tiny crawling fingers. A second later, the stitches tore themselves open. A fresh wave of pain sent him convulsing against the sheets as the black threads pulled apart in jagged, twitching motions. His skin peeled back with them, exposing raw, pink tissue that shouldn't have been moving, but it was. Beneath his torn flesh, something pulsed. His intestines weren't his. The insides of his stomach twitched, flexed, reacted to the open air like a living thing. The writhing shapes squirmed in slow, grotesque undulations. Ryan choked on bile as he realized his own organs were coiling, rearranging, breathing. He screamed. Two doctors rushed in, followed by a third man, Dr. Vasquez. "Hold him down," Vasquez ordered, rolling up his sleeves as if this were routine. The nurses grabbed Ryan's arms and legs, pinning him to the bed as he thrashed against the unimaginable pain. He felt the wet, shifting mass of his own insides dragging themselves into new positions, curling and tightening beneath his exposed skin. "Don't fight it," Vasquez murmured. His voice was calm, too calm. "The process is almost complete." Ryan screamed as his stomach began to sew itself shut. The black sutures twitched back to life, burrowing through raw, bleeding flesh as they re-stitched the wound, pulling his own skin together. Ryan sobbed, his body convulsing as the needlework of living flesh stitched him shut from the inside out. He wasn't healing. He was being repaired. The moment the final suture tightened in place, the pain ceased, not gradually, but instantly. Ryan lay there gasping, body soaked in sweat and blood. Dr. Vasquez exhaled. "There, good as new." Ryan turned his head, rage and terror burning in his eyes. "What the fuck did you?" The words died in his throat, because Vasquez was smiling, not in a kind way, not even in a satisfied way, but in a hungry way. Ryan's chest rose and fell too smoothly. The pain was gone, completely. But something was wrong. His body felt lighter, like an empty shell. Vasquez reached for something on the counter, a clipboard. He flipped a few pages, then made a small note. "The integration was a success. The new tissue accepted the graft perfectly." "What?" Ryan croaked, his throat dry. "What did you do to me?" Vasquez looked up, his grin widening. "Oh, we just had to make some adjustments." He gestured lazily toward Ryan's abdomen. "You were falling apart, but we fixed you." Ryan looked down, his breath catching in his throat. His skin was still moving. The stitches were gone. The wound was sealed. But beneath the surface, his flesh still squirmed, shifted, breathed. Something was still alive inside him. Something that wasn't him. His fingers trembled as he pressed them to his stomach. It pressed back. His scream echoed down the sterile white hallways of the hospital, but the doctors had already turned away. He was no longer a patient. He was a success.